I work at St. Thomas University. I'm a researcher in the Sustainability and Environmental Studies program, and I lead a project called CEDAR. And I was asked to talk about renewable energy, and I'm going to talk about the transition to renewable energy, which is why we're talking about it in the first place. So I've been a researcher for about 30 years, about 20 of them here in New Brunswick. And I came to New Brunswick, my expertise is technology adoption. I came to work at the National Research Council, even though I'm a social scientist. And now, yeah, I do social science on how technologies are adopted in communities. So, of course, that's not clicking now. We just down arrow. Oh yeah, that's why. Technology, right? Okay, so the thing I'll just say about the CEDAR project, which is all about energy, is we have a wealth of expertise there, people like probably a couple of centuries worth of expertise on energy issues. But I'm grateful, and we're very fortunate to have two Indigenous partners, Chief Hugh Akaji, who you all know, and Kim Reeder, who I work with closely with the PRGI, and then Chief Ron Tremblay with the Woolastook Grand Council. Right, so I thought, and I actually now I'm glad I did this just for the presentation I caught this morning, that I would talk about how we got to even talking about, why are we even talking about renewable energy? So this is the history from biomass to fossil fuels, and I just have one graph in this section. And it's really, really interesting for me. So what we have on the bottom here is years. It starts from 1800 to where we are now in 2024. And then I have this little arrow there. And what that shows is for actually, that could have gone on for tens of thousands, 100,000 years. That what people were using for energy before all these fossil fuels for tens of thousands of years was what we call biomass. So that was mostly wood products, also things like peat, certainly, burning animal dung, things like that. And all of the different civilizations that we had, everything was all fueled by biomass. That was it. Up until around here. And then things started to go up. And the interesting thing, I mean, if people, the part of the presentation I heard this morning talking about in our lifetimes, I was born in the late 1950s. And you can see, like in my lifetime, we've had a huge increase in the amount of fossil fuels that we use. And it's not just about population increase, because the population from 1800 until now increased about 8 times, but we've had a huge, far more than that, of fossil fuels. Okay, so, right, so what happened? What happened there? Around 1800, we had something called the Industrial Revolution. And so what that was all about was the transition, not just to fossil fuels, it started with coal. It was the transition from human power and animal power to machine power, right? The things that we used to do with our own hands and our own bodies and that we had animals to do, we started building machines to do that for us. And that is what happened, and those machines required fossil fuels, and that's what happened since then. So it's really just been, you know, within my lifetime, certainly like 1800, 7 generations ago, say, that all of this started. Yeah, okay. Right, the British Industrial Revolution. So here we have a time scale as well. This one starts 1,000 years before the Common Era. 1750 is the official start of the Industrial Revolution. And then look what happened. So these are what's called the Global Well-Being Index. It's a UN marker. And of course, when we think of global well-being, obviously, some people experience more well-being than others, right? There's vast disparities when we talk about global well-being. There's there's countries and there's populations and people that experience well-being more than others. But just as globally, what happened after the Industrial Revolution, after this massive increase in fossil fuels, is this huge rise in what we call Global Well-Being Index. Life expectancy overall, over the whole world, went up. GDP per capita, meaning we were making more things, we were consuming more things, we were buying more things. People not living in extreme poverty went way up. So the poverty index went down. Energy capture, people were eating a lot more food, a greater variety of food. Unfortunately, we also had a greater war-making capacity, and then the number of people living in a democracy. So all of that was fueled with fossil fuels. That's what it did. Steel, concrete, all the things we can think of that required fossil fuels to develop. Oh, here I go. I'm wrong ones again. Okay. So yeah, so this all required reserves of fossil fuels. We all know this also put a lot more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Again, you see the same curve here. Of course, we need some greenhouse gases. That's what actually keeps the Earth warm at a temperature where you know, life can live. But the problem is there's too much of it going into the atmosphere now from burning fossil fuels. So this is a really interesting diagram. It's called the planetary boundaries diagram, and I think it only came out a few years ago. I'm not sure about that, but I only came across it a couple of years ago, and they just released another report. It might only be their second report. And what this is, you have the Earth at the center. What these scientists have come up with are 9 different boundaries, they're calling them, that are responsible for keeping a livable planet. And so these are the 9 different areas that we have to keep within boundaries so that the planet is livable for all of us and all of living creatures. So here, for example, this is an oceans conference. There's ocean acidification, and this zone of colors here shows what's the safe operating distance and where we're getting into increasing risk. And the latest report said that there's only 2 different boundaries that haven't been exceeded. There are only 2 that are in the safe zone. Ocean acidification is heading into the high risk zone. I've been talking about climate change up there. It's actually getting into the increasing risk in terms of the actual heat, which would also include, agricultural outputs and stuff. We're way into the high risk zone. But the talk that I was at this morning, the last one, is really talking about this one, which is the change in biosphere integrity. So you have genetic diversity. That's where you get, and this is, way off the map. We're in the high risk zone there. And that means, fewer animals and a lot of animals going extinct at a rate that we haven't seen before. Functional integrity is also part of this biosphere. It means how things work together. Everything, from soil microbes all the way through the ecosystem. We're in the high risk zone. And the thing about this is, this is all related to the rapid use of fossil fuels, because it's fossil fuels that allowed these the society to evolve at the rate that it has. This would not have been possible. This huge rise in everything we're doing would not have been possible without fossil fuels. But that is what has given us our quality of life, so-called global well-being. So this is where we're at right now, right? This is where we're at right now. So how is this going to end? Well, part of it might end through legislation, and these right here are Canada's targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because they're just really focused on the greenhouse gas. And you see, for example, in 2030, we're supposed to phase out coal. We have 1 coal plant in New Brunswick. It's the Belledune plant. There's 4 coal plants in Nova Scotia. They have, I can't remember how many there are across the country, but that's like one of the indicators. So it's possible we might phase out fossil fuels through legislation. However, this is another graph that I'll look at. It's eventually going to run out, right? I mean, there's only so much of it. We're using fossil fuels at a rate millions and millions of times faster than it was actually created, right? This is fossil fuels, depending on the type, are really plankton that was floating, most of it oil, say, plankton that was floating on ancient oceans over millions of years from pressure and just over time turned into oil, for example. Coal was made slightly differently, but basically these are all the different sources of fossil fuels that exist. This article I'd be happy to send to anyone. It's the most comprehensive article of when this is all going to run out, if we do that. So you can see again that it started, again, the Industrial Revolution, and whoop, we're using all these fossil fuels and just right off the map. A lot of experts say that the year 2025, where we are right now, is actually the peak. Like, we've actually gone through pretty well halfway of what the reserves that are left. That's the best guess. So if we continue to use them at the rate that we're using them now, this is how long it would last, like another couple hundred years. And then we would be completely out of fossil fuels, which I hope doesn't happen because they are very useful for doing a lot of things. But if we were to use them all, that's how long it would be. However, if we were to burn all these things, the planet would be unlivable, right? It would exceed most planetary boundaries long before fossil fuels were extracted. So, well, here I go again. Oh, I am going. I thought I had another one there. Right, so the point is, it's not just that we have to stop using fossil fuels because of the climate, it's also because of all these other planetary boundaries that are being exceeded. Right, so what comes after? What comes after fossil fuels? And that's really what I'm going to be talking about, the technologies that we can use to replace fossil fuels. So this is a diagram. I'm going to show you part of it now and then part of it in a minute. Don't worry about the numbers. All this means is the numbers here add up to this number at the top, 93.6 quads, which is an estimate of how much energy is used in the United States, which is the largest consumer of energy in the world, is the US. So what you have here are the 8 sources of energy that are used to power absolutely everything in the US, from transportation to homes. Petroleum is the biggest one. So in a barrel of oil, you get oil, diesel, chemicals for making plastics, asphalt, everything. So petroleum is the biggest use of energy in the US, and then you have biomass, coal, gas. The ones I'm going to be talking about mostly solar, nuclear, hydro, wind. There's also geothermal. This is kind of a head spinner.
The biggest polluter in the world is the U.S. military.
The biggest polluter in the world is U.S. military. You're absolutely right. And unfortunately, they do not release the data. You may be aware of that. They do not release the data on the amount of fossil fuels they use. They say that's classified information, so that isn't even counted in the huge numbers that we see coming out of the U.S. So what this diagram shows, and again, don't worry about the numbers, and it looks a little complicated, but what it shows is energy flows. So all these different sources of energy, what happens, what are they doing? So the biggest source of, these are called services in the pink boxes. The biggest service that energy supports is transportation in the US. Then you get industrial uses, commercial, and residential. So if you look at this and you look at what's actually powering these services, you could see that most of what's powering, certainly transportation, is fossil fuels, industrial uses, right? Commercial, residential. So this is homes, this is small business and commercial buildings. This is all of industry, and this is all of transportation. That would include everything from certainly cars, trucks, diesel, jet fuel, ocean liners, everything in transportation. It's all fossil fuels now. So how are we going to get rid of fossil fuels, right? This is what powers our countries right now. And the only way it's going to happen is this. If we can move all of these services are powered by electricity, and then we get fossil fuels off the electricity grid. I mean, it's crazy when you look at the numbers here, what it's going to take to do that. But all of these different services, it's possible to power them by electricity, and that's the only way of getting off of fossil fuels, is if we power everything by electricity, and then we get fossil fuels off the electricity grid. It's a huge task. Right, so you'll hear this phrase, electrify everything and take carbon-based fuels off the electricity grid. It's the only way of doing it, while keeping within planetary boundaries, right? This is the big elephant in the room, and this is the big problem that we face, and it's also the biggest political problem. Because if we just replace all of the fossil fuels we're using now with renewable energy, and we're still consuming the planet at the same rate we're doing it, we're still going to be exceeding those planetary boundaries, right? Like, you know, salmon don't care whether their environment is being destroyed by fossil fuels or by wind energy, right? They don't care. It's the same problem. We're just overusing the planet's resources. And so this is the big problem that we're facing right now. Okay, so what are the options for non-fossil electricity systems? There are 8 options for generating electricity without fossil fuels. There's only 5 of them that are currently being used in Canada. Wood pellets, solar power, onshore wind, hydroelectric, and nuclear power. There are 3 options that are certainly possible, but they're not currently generating electricity in Canada. They're offshore wind, tidal power, and geothermal. I don't know if Elise is here. No, you're, okay, she's going to be talking this afternoon about marine power, which is going to be the 3, but they're not currently generating electricity in Canada. We have no offshore wind right now, no tidal power, and no geothermal generating electricity in Canada.
Actually doesn't seem like a good option.
Pardon me?
I mean, like, offshore wind, I just think, what is it gonna do to our oceans? Tidal power, are you kidding me? Like,
Well, I would say this is absolutely what Elisa wants to hear. I know a little bit about those, but I'm certainly not an expert on those, and she is, and she'll be talking this afternoon about those 3. So I agree. What's that? A tidal power. Yeah, I know something about tidal power. I mean, it's still very experimental, I'll put it that way, at the time, at this moment. Although there is now, actually in Scotland, there is a plant. Anyway, I won't get into it. She'll be talking about that this afternoon. Okay, so there's 5 options that we have in Canada. Wood, solar, onshore wind, hydroelectric, nuclear power, and that's what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so 4 of these systems are renewable energy: wood, solar, onshore wind, electric. 1 of them is non-renewable, that's nuclear, although some claims are made that nuclear is renewable, and I'm going to talk about that briefly. Wood pellets, carbon-based, produces greenhouse gases. I'll get into that in a minute. There's 4 other systems that produce electricity without greenhouse gases: solar, onshore wind, hydroelectric, and nuclear. These 3 systems, wood, solar, and onshore, take about 3 to 5 years to grid connection if you're starting from 0. So if you want to, scale up quickly, those are the 3. Hydroelectric and nuclear take 20 years or more to grid connection. Okay, but all of these systems, as I said, can exceed planetary boundaries, right? All of them can. But only one makes forever radioactive waste, right? Okay, so first I'm going to talk about wood pellets. So probably a lot of you, do any of you have pellet stoves in your home? No? They're kind of? Okay. They're pretty common especially in rural areas, but I know people in cities who have them. They're an efficient, affordable way to heat space. However, if they were widely used, like if everybody heated only with pellet stoves, it would be unsustainable. They'd use up forest faster than they could be replaced. And I saw actually one study that said if 3 of the eastern seaboard states, I guess it was Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire, if everybody replaced everything that they're using to heat their home now with just wood, that there'd be no forest left after 2 winters. That's how much it would take. But, at the rate they're happening now, it's not really a problem. However, similar to fossil fuels, they do emit greenhouse gases. It's a carbon-based fuel. And they emit these dangerous, what they're called PM 2.5 particles, which I could talk more about, but they're the little particles that can get into your bloodstream and cause cancer. Right. However, for electricity, it is a bad idea. NB Power is proposing to convert the Belledune coal plant with the fuel with wood pellets. Why is it bad? It's a very inefficient way to make electricity. Very, very inefficient. Similar to fossil fuels, it emits greenhouse gases and these dangerous particles. And because they have these stacks, this is the largest, this one's in the UK, it's the largest biomass electricity plant. We don't have any in Canada yet, right? Biomass electricity plant in the world. It is, so the smokestacks means those particles go further. The problem is, in the long term, burning wood for electricity will destroy our forests and weaken biodiversity. If you know anything about this Drax plant, there was a scandal a few years ago. They're sourcing a lot of the pellets from Canada, and they're actually cutting down old growth forests in BC to burn in the UK in these wood pellets. Yeah. So if we converted, to biomass, to wood pellets, all of our coal plants, it'll worsen conditions for the rural communities and small businesses in these areas being stripped and where the wood is burned, and it'll eventually reduce ecosystem and social system sustainability. Okay, now we get to solar. So,
sorry, just one second.
Yeah.
When you asked if I had wood pellets,
Yeah.
no one raised their hand.
Yeah.
But who has a wood stove?
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So it's interesting, right?
Yes.
We have a quite wide.
No, that's a really good point. Yeah, wood stoves. Yeah, I mean, again, small scale, it's not a problem, right? And it's been that way for thousands and thousands of years. It's a question about, as we're getting off fossil fuels, like if people were not heating their homes with oil or gas and just started burning wood again, that's where we get into problems, right? But at the scale it is now, it's not a problem. Okay, solar energy, right. So this is just to say that, for thousands of years, passive solar, sunshine has been used for heat, clearly, right? Windows, we, put our houses facing south to capture the sun. I've seen roofs that have PVC piping on them to heat water, like all that passive solar. It's inexpensive, low tech. It's not enough to provide heat for Canadian winters, obviously, but the solar power has been around for a long time. And solar panels for rooftop solar is increasingly popular. This is actually, I know these people off-grid just north of Fredericton. It can be used to supplement grid electricity or go off-grid in the Maritimes. It is revolutionizing energy in countries with considerable hours of sunshine that don't experience the same cold winters that we do. In Canada, you might not be aware of this. One of the reasons it's not going as quickly as it could in other countries is we have a 162% tariff on solar panels made in China because we're trying to grow a solar panel industry in Canada, especially in BC, as I understand it. And they consider that the solar panels coming in from China are being dumped, and so there's a 162% tariff, so they're very expensive. In other countries where they don't have that tariff on the solar panels, there's a lot more uptake, right? Right. Now this is different than rooftop solar. It's utility or grid scale solar. It's what's called a variable power source, meaning the sun doesn't shine all the time, so it must be paired with energy storage, but even including the cost of energy storage. Right now, it's the least expensive new energy option in countries with affordable panels. Now, the trick is NB Power does not want solar on its grid because it does not pair well with nuclear energy. This is the problem. NB Power wants to be a nuclear utility. So solar is less expensive when it's operating, and then NB Power runs into a problem. What do you do with this cheap energy when you've got this expensive nuclear plant going? Because nuclear doesn't ramp up and down. So it will buy solar power from independent operators, but it doesn't want solar on its grid because it interferes with the nuclear reactor, basically. Okay.
The utility company, Prince Edward Island, put it to me this way.
Yeah.
My First Nation is developing a 32 megawatt solar field,
Okay.
and we asked them, why is there difficulties integrating this into the grid?
Uh-huh.
their answer was that they have power purchase agreements that do not account for on-demand power, or not on-demand power.
Yeah.
So like they have their grid, and the solar grid is separate in their eyes as of right now, and they can't guarantee to sell that power that's generated. So it becomes a weird situation where you could have panels in your yard, the power goes out, you have no power.
That's really interesting, Tim. And I mean, to me, if we get into a discussion of where NB Power could go in the future, for example, or other utilities, they have to become more flexible, right? To be able to, as you say, you know, to have power when you need it, it's available and it doesn't interfere with things like power purchase agreements or these big thermal plants like nuclear plants where you can't turn them off, basically. That's really interesting. So another, it takes a lot of land, but they can, you know, that land can still be used for shade crops and animals. It's not like you can't use a solar farm for anything else, right? And I'll be interested to talk to you later about what you're working on. There's a challenge with recycling panels after the end of life. So that technology still isn't where it needs to be. So we're not really there yet because solar panels last for 30 years or more. So we're not necessarily talking about recycling solar panels, but at the moment, the technology isn't really there. And so people are kind of left with a choice of, do we want to go through an expensive recycling program or do we want to stick them in the dump, right? And obviously we know what's going to happen there. And so we've got to get the recycling up to where it needs to be. They also use critical minerals that are currently not often recycled or sometimes not mined sustainably. And I just saw a presentation yesterday from a colleague at university about what's happening with nickel mining, nickel being used in solar panels in indigenous communities in Indonesia, for example. So that's something we have to be really mindful of, is where the critical minerals are coming from for these panels. Onshore wind. Okay, I just heard a comment just before I started presenting about onshore wind and bats, but I won't go there because I really don't know about that. But so wind is a variable source. The cost of wind, including storage, is slightly more than solar, but again, it costs less than nuclear. But again, NB Power doesn't want wind on its grid because it does not pair well with nuclear energy, right? This is the problem here. The key thing about, for this group in particular, but I would say it where whoever I'm talking to, is Indigenous nations and communities are leading onshore wind development across Canada, which is super exciting. If you look at all the wind power projects across Canada, most of them are partnered, or some of them are actually fully owned by Indigenous communities. And we're currently doing a project in collaboration with PRGI studying wind power in the Wabanaki homeland. In particular, in New Brunswick, Ottawa gave about $1 billion for new Indigenous-led wind projects in New Brunswick about a year ago. So there's a lot happening in that space. There's actually more than 30 wind projects with Indigenous partners in the Wabanaki homeland, the whole area, in different stages of development. 12 of these are currently operational. This one's Birch Hill Wind, Tobic First Nation, a kind of a flagship project. This is certainly one of them. 12 of them are operational, either Mi'kmaq or Wolastoqey projects, and we're looking at those 12 projects right now. Very exciting stuff. So wind power has tremendous potential for New Brunswick and Atlantic Canada. There's huge offshore wind projects in development, and that's going to be, I think, talked about after the break. The challenge for wind projects in particular is securing community acceptance. There is a lot of resistance to wind projects, and so they have to be developed in a way that the community's on board and the community sees clear benefits for these machines in their environment. Okay, hydro, right. It's by far, the most common renewable energy resource in the world and in Canada, like by far. It was the first renewable energy, and we have a lot of rivers in Canada, and they were dammed up, over the last 100 years. Water power, were used for mills long before hydroelectricity was invented. We've had hydro for about 150 years, right? This is the Mactaquac hydro plant on the Woolastock. It's the largest in the Maritimes. It's in need of major repairs. The latest estimate is $9 billion, and replacing it with wind power would be less expensive. So this is kind of part of the issue now. One of the problems with hydro the world over is that because of climate change, there's being many countries affected by droughts that may become permanent. And so that's going to affect water levels, and it means that the plants won't be as productive. There's been a few hydro dams opened, one big one that opened in BC just earlier this year actually, started operating. Quebec's planning a new one, they say, in Labrador in partnership with the government there. But there's likely to be few other hydro plants built in Canada. They're very expensive and they have many environmental problems that you know about. The new dams disrupt entire regions. They disrupt fish migrations. We've been talking about that. The mercury in the soil, once it's actually flooded, the mercury can flood out of the soil into the water, contaminate fish and poison humans. There's silting problems whenever you put up a dam. Not only affects the water flow, but it affects the quality of the water, the type of fish that you can have there. The reservoirs emit methane, which is a greenhouse gas, and then there's always the possibility of dam failure, which hasn't happened in Canada with hydro dams, but it has happened, unfortunately, in other countries. Okay, now nuclear power. So it's the most expensive way to generate electricity. How it works is a reactor splits uranium atoms, it generates heat to make steam, and that turns a turbine, and that is captured to make electricity. Splitting uranium atoms also creates radioactive waste, and the used reactor fuel is the most toxic. This is a picture of the Point Lepreau nuclear plant on the Bay of Fundy. It's the only nuclear plant outside of Ontario that's operating. We have 17 operating in Ontario right now, and this one in New Brunswick. In New Brunswick, highly radioactive waste is stored in hundreds of aging concrete silos outside on a site near the Bay of Fundy in Passamaquoddy Territory, right? Nuclear power is not renewable because uranium is used for fuel. Radioactive mine tailings in places where the uranium has been mined, they litter Indigenous lands in Canada, the US, and several other countries. Radioactivity is caused by unstable uranium atoms. It cannot be turned off, and it remains toxic for hundreds of generations. Exposure to radioactivity can damage living cells, certainly, cause cancer and genetic damage. As I said, it's the only plant operating outside of Ontario. It was the build and the refurbishment is responsible for about 2/3 of NB Power's $5.9 billion debt. It's poor performance. It's shut down now. It's been shut down for a number of months. It's going to be shut down again next year. The poor performance is the main reason NB Power loses money every year, almost every year. But despite the financial loss, NB Power plans to build another reactor on the site. Okay, now can nuclear power be renewable? There's a company called Moltex. I don't know if anyone's heard of that company. It wants to extract, one of the things that happens inside a reactor is it makes a product called plutonium. It wants to extract plutonium from used nuclear fuel at Point Lepreau to make new reactor fuel. And advocates are actually saying that this process can make nuclear power renewable because you can take the old fuel and make new fuel. But however, this so-called closed fuel cycle has been tried and abandoned in several European countries for being expensive and polluting. Additional concerns include making plutonium available commercially because, of course, it's used for nuclear weapons. And despite huge public subsidies, the Moltex project has not attracted the billions it needs in private investment. So the project is unlikely to go ahead unless it's fully subsidized by the federal government. Okay, so I'm almost done. Transition to renewable energy. Of the 5 non-fossil fuel electricity systems operating in development in Atlantic Canada, only 3 are truly renewable: hydro, wind, and solar. The standout is wind power, for sure. It's also the energy system for which Indigenous communities and nations are already playing a leading role. However, it needs more community acceptance. Rooftop solar has many advantages. Utility solar faces challenges, still good, with sustainable mining and panel recycling. Hydroelectric will remain important, but it poses many environmental problems. Wood pellets are okay for small-scale home heating. So is just regular wood, not pellets. But a bad idea for making electricity, which would be inefficient, generate greenhouse gases, weaken biodiversity. It's not renewable at scale. And finally, nuclear power is the most expensive way to generate electricity. It takes a long time to build. It generates toxic forever radioactive waste. And the claim that nuclear can be renewable is misinformation. In conclusion, electrify everything, take fossil fuels off the electricity grid, and keep within planetary boundaries. Thank you.
So I'm going to pick up on the nuclear energy theme, which is where Susan kind of left off. And then I'm going to dive in a bit deeper there as well. I don't think I need to introduce myself again. It's nice to see you all again. But I am Kerrie Blaise, an environmental lawyer and founder of Legal Advocates for Nature's Defense. So yesterday we talked about Indigenous rights and UNDRIP and the various ways in Canadian and international law that those rights can be protected. Today I want to actually apply that to the context of energy. I'm going to talk about nuclear energy specifically to try and unpack how do you take an energy project, in this case nuclear, and think about UNDRIP and think about the different laws and impact assessment and licensing regimes that are in place. When you put that all together, what do we get and how do you actually work your way through that process? So this is a bit more of a fun one for me because it means we can apply the UNDRIP framework and the principles and actually see how it's playing out currently. So I'll start with a bit of information on energy projections and rise and fall of nuclear specifically. I'm going to look at some headlines. It's hard to dissect what we see in the media, you know, the truth, the value, the information behind those words that we might see in the news. Then we'll get into the third part will be like the kind of legal weeds of it all. Which is fun, I promise. And then changes and way forward. How do we bring it all together and where do we go from here? So Susan, that was excellent. Like an awesome presentation to kind of set up where does nuclear fit within the energy mix. And so every year there's an incredible report that gets released called the World Nuclear Industry Status Report. And it tracks the use of nuclear energy globally. And so I was leafing through it the other day, and sure enough, nuclear energy, no surprise, continues to trend downwards when you look at its stake in the global energy sector. So it's now down to 9%. Last year, the year before that was like 9.4, so it's continuing to track downwards. And it peaked in 1996. So since 1996, nuclear energy has repeatedly been declining. And we're actually in an era of decommissioning where 1/3 of all nuclear power plants around the world, the ones in Canada being no exception, are now entering that phase of decommissioning or end of life. So we're increasingly living with this critical mass of radioactive waste and a question of what do we do with it? The cool thing is, since 2024, renewable energy generation has surpassed nuclear power generation. So renewables are definitely on the upward trend, even compared to nuclear. And for me, I find this rather fascinating because the news might give you a different perception. So these are just some headlines and quotes that I pulled. So OPG, which is quite heavily involved here in the province as well as the Ontario Power Generation. You know, this was a headline that says they become the first utility to snag ownership in a nuclear micro-reactor project. How exciting. And then this, highlighted point, the ARC 100 unit will become operational in the late 2020s, which is almost now. Another, a first for Canada, a new type of nuclear power plant is going to open by 2028. And then CEOs exclaiming their excitement. They're excited about the advancement of low carbon, small modular reactors in Canada. They're innovative, opportunities for our company that will help with, clean energy. So these are the buzzwords we hear, innovative, clean energy, going to help with climate. But in reality, for these same projects where all that excitement was, bustling, now NV Power CEO says they're unsure if they're going to actually get anything ready by the late 2030s. And also there was another micro-reactor project. It's now in doubt. That was in Chalk River outside of Ottawa. And then another nuclear developer, they went bankrupt and they got sold. So they no longer exist. So, in that context, that's a time frame of within a decade. You go from all this excitement and innovation to, well, we're not sure we're on track, and we're not sure we actually have the money to do it, so we're going to go bankrupt instead. So there's a lot of hype still about something called SMRs, or small modular reactors, and that's what's proposed at the Point Lepreau nuclear power site. They want an SMR. They don't know which one yet, and that's not a surprise because there is no one-size-fits-all design for SMRs. There's hundreds of designs. They all rely on different types of fuel, and their waste products are all slightly different, including how you store it safely. But generally, it's meant to refer to a reactor of, up to 200 megawatts, maybe 300 megawatts. My slide says 300, so I'll go with 300. And it's, for electricity or heat generation. The modular component is the hope that they can be assembled in a factory, put on trucks, and driven out, and then modularly connected on site. They are not small. These are still very large reactors. So don't think about it being somehow a small. The S in SMR is very much a misnomer. And they're proposed for here in New Brunswick at the Point Lepreau site. So existing nuclear facilities. They're also proposed for remote communities that rely on diesel generation and for mine sites. And so it raises huge concerns about security risks and remote communities where you don't have, airports that are, where there are personnel on an ongoing basis, and to have both radioactive fuel being flown in and out without community members knowing, because again, for security purposes, there isn't disclosure about the travel of these products. Is very concerning. And so that's what's being proposed, but what are the kind of legal hooks that it has to get through for it to happen? So I'll go through two regimes. The first one is a federal impact assessment process, and I bet a number of you are familiar with impact assessments. And so impact or environmental assessments are a planning tool. They're about looking before you leap. So before you actually build the project, what are all of the impacts that project could have? And you study that, and you get all the information. You understand the socio-economic effects, the cultural effects, the environmental effects. You're looking upstream and downstream and at the full timeline, from that project, when you first have to build it, to its operation, to its decommissioning. You have all of that in front of you. And depending upon what the project is, it then goes to a panel review, and there's public comment periods, and there's hearings. And so that's generally how that process works. But unfortunately, it doesn't apply, by and large, to nuclear projects. So if the reactor is under 200 megawatts, you don't need an impact assessment. Or if it's at an existing site, like Point Lepreau, even if it's 900 megawatts, you don't need an impact assessment. So it's only, a scarce handful of projects that ever would trigger the impact assessment process. So it would leave you with questions about, well, what are the cumulative effects? And how do communities actually have a say in a process when this effectively does not apply? The Impact Assessment Act, again, is under attack from Bill C-5, which is now law, the Building Canada Act. It got passed in July. And Prime Minister Carney is saying, impact assessment is duplicative. We don't need this. It's red tape. But it never applied in the first place, and yet it should. So under the Impact Assessment Act, there's a regulation called the Project List Regulation. If you're on the list, you need an impact assessment. If you're not on the list, no IA needed. It is undergoing review, and there was huge response from Indigenous communities across the country saying you can't remove nuclear projects from the impact assessment regime. We're still waiting for those updates. We're still waiting for the final word from the federal government on if there will be new additions or inclusions to that list. So that's a bit of a put a pin in it and wait for updates. The other piece that would apply to, let's say, an SMR at the Point Lepreau site is the need for a license. And this little infographic is from the Nuclear Regulator's website. And the way you would get a license is you need to put your blinders on, and you just need to get a license for the immediate activity of what you're doing. So if you're preparing the site, that's where you begin. So you prepare the site, you bring in an excavator, you get some gravel, you put up a fence, you'd get a license for that. And so that would be the very first step, which is a license to prepare a site. And the regulator would just look at, well, what are the adverse impacts of, leveling the ground, putting up a fence? And the regulator has found in other instances, that's a pretty low impact activity, you get a license. And then you move on to the construction phase. And again, they say, well, when you're constructing a reactor, it's concrete. You're just pouring concrete. There's no radioactivity, no harm. Great. You want a license? Got a license. It's not until you actually get to the license to operate phase that the regulator will actually talk about the radioactive component that's inherent to nuclear power. And so right now for the SMR here in New Brunswick, they're still in the very first stage, the license to prepare a site stage, and that license has currently not been granted. What is most concerning about this approach, it means concerns about waste, which is inevitable to any nuclear reactor. You don't talk about the waste until you need a license to decommission, so a license to shut down, essentially. So that means even like for all of us in this room, we're being told, come back in 20, 30, or 40 years. And if you have concerns about radioactivity and waste and disposal, we'll hear you, but in like 40 years' time. And then eventually when you get to the license to abandon stage, and there are some uranium mines that hold a license to abandon, that's even further into the future. And so when you compare nuclear licensing to an impact assessment process, you have one impact assessment where you have to meet the conditions of UNDRIP. You have to meet those principles. You have to consider international obligations for climate and sustainability and biodiversity and cumulative effects. That is core to it. But that doesn't apply. And so instead you're left with a licensing process where you're just taking a piecemeal approach. It's purposely done that way. And you can actually, weigh in or have information about the full effects of the project until many years down the line. The other piece I'll add, and Susan and Kim are aware of it too, is unfortunately the CNSC, which is the regulator, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, they were founded in the 1940s with a mandate to promote the technology. It was their legislated mandate. They had to create the technology to help build an atomic bomb. That was at Chalk River in Ontario. And then after World War II, when it became unfashionable to be involved in nuclear weapons, they took a step back and they said, no, nuclear is peaceful, and we're going to make it for peaceful energy purposes. But that kind of institutional dynamic of promoting the industry has stuck despite them being founded in the 40s. And so still today, the decision makers at the CNSC, so the ones you would appear in front of and the ones you would write your comments to, they themselves have industry backgrounds. They're from industry. They're very strong proponents of nuclear industry. So it's very difficult when, even if you are applying for a license and you want to intervene and appear in that hearing environment, you're in an environment that's already biased towards the industry. And that takes me to my next slide, which is, well, how is it going? How is it all playing out
Kerrie,
already?
before you go there,
Yeah.
you mentioned a sentence, you said, that they don't, no one, besides Point Lepreau, there's no other license to start prep site that's been given.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
not because they've tried and it was denied. It's just because they haven't fully gotten through the
True.
process yet. Chances
Correct.
are the license will be given. It's just they haven't gotten that far in the process.
100%. So that is something really key to wait for and watch for and like participate in, because my understanding is they've submitted the application for the license, but there hasn't been a hearing yet, no 30-day public comment period, that type of thing. But yes, they haven't been denied one. That is true. It's still, and they'll probably get it when that point in time comes. So kind of a case in point is a nuclear waste burial project in Algonquin Territory along the Kitchizebe or the Ottawa River. And that's where nuclear first started in Canada. So you're just meters away from the Ottawa River. And it's called the Near Surface Disposal Facility. And Canadian Nuclear Laboratories got a license to construct essentially a glorified dump. It's the same technology, dig a hole in the ground, put a liner in it, fill the dump with the waste, and then put a cap on top. That's the basic of the design. Except this would be a very large dump. It's going to be 7 stories tall. It's going to store 1 million cubic meters of waste. And in the interim, to get there, they're going to cut down 37 hectares of old-growth forest and risk contaminating drinking water for about 9 million people. And so when this site in the 1940s got developed for nuclear reactor technology, and it's now decommissioned, and the waste was brought there, there was no consent given by Quebec First Nation or any of the other Algonquin communities. In 2016, an environmental assessment process started, and this was under previous legislation. And then the environmental assessment and license, they are both granted together in 2023. Oh, early 2024. It was late 2023. And when that license got granted, there's a very short window. When a government regulator issues a decision, you have 30 days to challenge it in court or to say, hey, I want to challenge this in court. So Quebec First Nation filed, it's called a judicial review of that licensing decision, saying, look, you issued a decision without applying UNDRIP, without applying Section 29.2 of the UNDRIP Act that requires our free, prior, and informed consent. And I think the timeline here is helpful in a sense. Like, it makes a judicial review look quite fast. Like, they filed it in 2024, and by 2025 we already had a decision. So in February 2025, it was Chief Justice Blackhawk who issued her decision, and in her decision she went back years and years and years. And so it was really telling that advocacy now, even if it's 8 or 9 or 10 years down the road, is the result or the outcome or the finality of whatever you're doing, it really, really matters, because Justice Blackhawk was going back to 2008 and leafing through letters that Quebec had sent to the government saying, look, we have a say, these are our lands, they will be forever contaminated, you can't allow this to proceed without our consent. And it was Article 29.2, that was the crux of this case. That was the entire proceeding was based on that article, which states that states, namely Canada, should take effective measures to ensure there's no storage or disposal of hazardous materials on Indigenous lands without their free, prior, and informed consent. And interesting, the nuclear regulator didn't say, well, we asked them if they consent and they said no, but we still gave them a license. The nuclear regulator said UNDRIP doesn't apply to us. They just said flat out, we don't look at that. That's not law that applies to us. And so it was Justice Blackhawk in her decision, she's like, no, hang on. You are required to consider UNDRIP. So that was a good win. It took many months in court to get that win, but Justice Blackhawk said unequivocally, yes, UNDRIP applies. So whether you're a nuclear regulator, the pipeline regulator, an environmental assessment body, UNDRIP applies to you. That should not be a surprise. And then Justice Blackhawk also said, she said, when considering how to conduct consultation, you have to take UNDRIP into your purview. And so that means looking at having a process that's designed so you can make a determination on consent. And so right now, Quebec is very busy working. They've been given a court deadline of September 30th of next year to redo the consultation with the nuclear regulator to kind of get it right and give the regulator, kind of a second kick at the can to figure out how they can grant a license. They still want to grant the license. They haven't revoked it yet. The license remains, but do so in a way that is respectful of Quebec's position, and it remains outstanding if that is even possible. And so the case is quite long, but there's many key paragraphs that are really awesome in my opinion, and I think we can all learn from, just to say, this is so new and so precedent setting that nuclear regulators or government agencies are very shy. They're very shy to talk about UNDRIP, and they're very shy to use it, but it can be used. And so Justice Blackhawk recognizes in paragraph 92 there is no Canadian jurisprudence that considers how the Articles of UNDRIP should be used. And so this is the first. And then in paragraph 128, she said that, UNDRIP has to be used as an interpretive framework for Section 35 constitutional rights. So if you find yourself in a meeting with a government agency or you're looking for some good arguments, I highly suggest just relying on Justice Blackhawk. It's an awesome decision, and she gives you lots of guidance on how UNDRIP can be used and applied and the obligations that have to be upheld. So to kind of bring it all together, where do we go from here? The first, or one aspect is to actually strengthen environmental protections and the regulation and laws around nuclear projects to ensure they actually protect nature and Indigenous rights and implement UNDRIP. That is just currently not happening. And Bill C-5, again, is very regressive in that way. The second aspect is to speak out in favor of renewable projects and not nuclear projects, which will not allow us to meet our climate goals. And at the end of the day, regardless of the project, regardless if you're for or against it, just to recall that everyone does have a right to participate, and that means a meaningful ability to participate. So, having open information and sharing and capacity supports, and you have a right to know. These are core, we call them principles of natural justice. They're not written down in any law, but they are just principles we all have, rights we all have and can rely on, the right to participate and the right to know. So when decisions are being made that can affect your health or your community, you have that right to access full information and that disclosure of information. And then just thank you, Miigwech. And I think we now have 15 minutes for questions and discussion.